Right, here we are, almost at the end of World War II, or the World War II unit. There are about maybe 2 weeks left of the World War II unit, and I just want to give you a heads up. At the end of not this week, but the next week, I'll be giving you guys kind of a short version of a quiz. Really, what that's designed to do is just help some of your grades. The way the gradebook is set up, certain types of assignments are given more weight than others. And because we haven't had a quiz or a test since distance learning started, some of you, those of you who are doing all the work and checking in, might see your grades go up a little bit, but then they kind of stay at the same level. That's because the type of assignments that we've been doing haven't been like quizzes, right? So I want to make sure that I give you one quiz at least at the end of the World War II unit, just to help those of you who have been on task and have been helping, or who have been participating. So don't be too stressed about it. As long as you're following along, as long as you're listening to all the lectures like this or reading all the chapters, you should be more than well prepared. All right, now I mentioned a few seconds ago that this is beginning to approach the end of World War II. Today and on Friday, we are going to see how World War II ends on or in the two major theaters. World War II is fought in what we call theaters, in two major parts of the world. There's the European theater, that's the Germans, Adolf Hitler, they're the Italians, Benito Mussolini, fighting against the British and the Soviet Union. And then you have the Pacific theater, which is Japan and the United States mostly. So just keep that in mind. If you're wondering why aren't we talking about Japan today, it's because our focus is going to be on the European theater. So what have we learned? What do we know about the European theater so far? So in the last few weeks, we've learned, or we looked at how the Axis powers, those were the Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, Imperial Japan, they're all teamed up. These three countries saw they have common goals, they have common ideas, so they teamed up. They called themselves the Axis, and they began invading nations in Europe, Africa, and Asia. And that goes back a couple of weeks. Now, we also saw how the Allied powers, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, that's Russia, began to go on the offensive. Remember that for a couple of years, the only country that was left fighting against the Germans was Britain, right? And they were playing defense. And eventually the Nazis decided they were going to attack the Soviet Union. So now the Soviet Union is playing defense. And then Japan decided to attack the US, and the US is playing defense against Japan for years. For about 2 or 3 years, the Axis are actually winning. They're the ones on the offensive. They're the ones taking over territories. And the Allied countries are just having to play defense. Today we're going to see, or rather in the last week, we saw how the US started to go on the offensive. Today, we're going to see how they finally win and how they defeat Nazi Germany. So that basically gives you the big objective. To be a little more specific, by the end of today's lesson, 32.4a, the Allied victory in Europe, you'll be able to, explain how the Allies turned the tide of the war. That's to say, the Nazis are winning, the tide's moving in their direction. We're going to see how the Allies turned the tide of war against the Nazis. And then we're also going to see how the Axis powers eventually lose World War II in Europe. So turning the tide of the war. Pretty simple strategy here. Just after Pearl Harbor, the leaders of the Allies, so the United States, the Soviet Union, and now the United States, all meet. And they gather to discuss a strategy on how to win the war in Europe. Now, it was agreed, they see a basic strategy here, that the United Kingdom and the US, which is off the map over here on the other side of the Atlantic, they would form a front on the western side of Europe, and they would attack the Nazi German-controlled territories from the west. Whereas the Soviet Union over here in the east would swoop in, they would effectively trap the Germans and attack them on both sides. Now, why was that a good idea? Well, that means that Germany would have to be fighting a war on two sides of Europe, two sides of a continent, effectively making Germany have to fight two wars at the same time. So that's the strategy they agree on. Now, this is going to be important for the next unit. So pay attention. The Soviet Union over here, their leader, Joseph Stalin, wants the British and the United States to immediately attack the Germans. The British and the United States say, no, you might be our ally, but we disagree with you. And so already at the start of this alliance, supposedly we're being friends with the Soviet Union, already you see tensions, you see disagreements between, and a little bit of distrust between the United States and the British on one side and the Soviet Union on the other side. Keep that in mind because that distrust is not going to disappear. It's not going to go away. It's going to be pervasive. It's going to be around through the World War, and it's going to dictate, it's going to shape a lot of how World War II ends. Where do they attack? Well, the British and the Americans decided, you know what, there is a better place to attack. The United Kingdom, the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, argues that instead of invading Germany from Europe, instead of going through Spain and France, what they should do is attack the soft underbelly from Africa. So he's basically saying, if Europe is an animal, right, and this is the head, and like here's the rump and here's the legs, Winston Churchill is saying, don't attack it at the head, don't attack it where it can see you, go in from the bottom. Attack Europe from the soft underbelly. Attack the Germans from their weakest or softest point. Well, they can't do that because Italy is technically a German ally, right? Remember, they're fascists. They're led by another dictator, Benito Mussolini. So what they do instead, skipping ahead, the Allies attack North Africa. Remember, the Germans are in control of North Africa. I think because they knew that this was a weakness. The Americans come in with the British and some Canadian forces and attack North Africa. This is in late 1942. This is about a year after Pearl Harbor, about 6 months after the gas chambers and the Holocaust start. So about 6 months later, the Allies are invading Africa. And they're pushing the Germans out. By May of 1943, the Germans are defeated in Africa. There are no more German forces in Africa unless they are prisoners of war of the United States and Britain. So the Germans flee away from Africa. They go back into Italy. They're in retreat. Now the Allies are able to launch an attack into Sicily, into Italy, and if all goes well, into Germany. Meanwhile, in the East, the Nazis are trying to go on the offensive again. And they want to go after a city. Really what they're going after is oil, or the oil fields in Russia. But along the way, there's a city called Stalingrad. And for a lot of reasons, this is a symbolic city. It's named after the leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin. So if the Nazis can take the city named after Joseph Stalin, that will be a big moral victory for the Nazi Germans. Stalin also sees this and says, you know what, if the Germans take my city, the city that's named after me, that's going to be a huge moral defeat for the Russians. And for me, it'll be a personal insult. So the Battle of Stalingrad becomes one of the most fiercely contested battles, one of the most vicious, it's the site of some of the most vicious fighting between the Germans and the Russians in World War II. While the Americans are landing in Africa, the Nazis are controlling Stalingrad. They took over 90% of the city, and it really seems like the Germans are going to win Stalingrad. But then their friend Winter, the Russian Winter, comes again. Apparently they didn't learn their lesson the first time. By November 19th, in the middle of this Russian winter, or the start of the Russian winter, the Nazis, who think they've done a great job by taking over the city of Stalingrad, find that the Russians have basically laid out a trap. And as the Germans take the city, the Red Army, the army of the Soviet Union, surrounds them. Now the Germans are trapped in the city that they thought they were going to capture. By February of 1943, so about 2 months later, 90,000 Germans surrendered to the Soviet Union. That's 90,000 out of an original 330,000. That means 2 out of 3 German soldiers were killed taking this city. Over 1 million Russians were killed fighting for this city. Uh, does this count as a victory? I mean, 99% of the city was destroyed. Well, that's a hard question. But what we do know is that the Germans were pushed out of the city, they surrendered. And even though 1 million Russians were killed, the moral victory of defending Stalingrad would empower the Red Army, would encourage them to push forward and now attack Germany. So now Russia's pushing back against Germany. Uh, Meanwhile, again, going back to Africa, the Allies are using North Africa as a base. After the Battle of Stalingrad in the summer, July 1943, they landed in Sicily, which is an island just south of Italy, and then eventually make their way into Italy. This is where it gets a little complicated because students will say, well, I thought Italy was on the Axis side. Well, that's not entirely true because there's also a large group of Italians who were anti-fascists. There were a lot of Italians who hated Benito Mussolini. And so when the Allies showed up and they start defeating the fascists, a lot of these resistance fighters come out and start supporting the US and they start supporting the British in Italy. And so basically what happens in Italy is you get a civil war. We're not going to go into the details of the civil war in Italy, or what was effectively a civil war in Italy, but what you should know is the fascists lose in Italy. By April 27, 1945, the Germans begin to flee. Mussolini, knowing that he is hated by a lot of Italians who maybe he was very popular at one point, but they saw him side with the Nazis, a lot of Italian fascists, even the fascists weren't comfortable with that, right? Like they see Mussolini almost as a betrayer. Mussolini tries to escape Italy. He disguises himself as a German, but Italian resistance fighters find him. Within a day, he's taken out, he's executed. They throw his body in the center of the largest city in northern Italy called Milan. And really what transpires is like people started taking the revenge out on the body. It's so bad, they actually have to hang his body from a butcher's hook just so that people wouldn't destroy the body. And he was basically disfigured. Like the Italians absolutely took out their revenge on what was left of Benito Mussolini. And it took a lot of people didn't trust that was Benito Mussolini's body by the end of this because it was so disfigured by the angry Italians. Now, why was his body why was he the focus of so much hate? Well, this was revenge, basically. A lot of the resistance fighters, they saw their friends suffer at the hands of the fascists. And so they took their revenge. This was revenge for the resistance fighters that the fascists had tortured and killed and done the same things to. Well, that's really dark. But this is what war is, right? Like it is not it's not a nice heroic thing. It's brutal. It's mean. It's savage. It's horrible. But it's not over yet. So let's do our first check for understanding. 3 questions, true and false, just as we've done. The Allied plan for victory in Europe involved a single focused attack from the east. Is that true or false? Number 2, Winston Churchill wanted the Allies to invade North Africa first, so they could launch an invasion from the south into the soft underbelly of Europe. And 3, fascist dictator Benito Mussolini was arrested, executed, and then hung in the center of Milan. All right. Onwards to literally victory. So let's see how they finally wrap this up. How do the Allies, how does the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union finally defeat the Nazis in Europe? There's a big operation, the largest naval invasion in history, is something called Operation Overlord. Now, Operation Overlord was a secret plan that started in 1943. In 1943, the Allies slowly and secretly start building up an invasion force in Britain. So over the course of about a year, the British are slowly building up their army. Americans are slowly shipping American soldiers into Britain. The Canadians are quietly sending their soldiers into Britain. They don't want to get the Germans' attention. because what they're planning is something huge. Uh, in fact, this huge thing was an invasion. And the idea was we're going to give the Germans everything that we have, and we're going to invade from the north. Now that we have them running in Italy, we're going to begin by invading France. Now, the Germans knew this attack was going to happen. They didn't know where. And it wasn't a complete surprise. And in fact, that's part of the reason why the first day of Operation Overlord was so deadly. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, a day that we call today D-Day. At dawn, American, British, and Canadian forces, and some French forces, the French forces who escaped from France just in time, all land in the northern coast of France called Normandy. The Allies took very heavy casualties on this first day, but they do take the coast. If you've ever seen Saving Private Ryan, the opening scene is of D-Day. That is the invasion. If you ever watched the HBO series Band of Brothers, it starts off with the early morning of D-Day. So it's a very famous, it's a very iconic battle in American history. You will learn way more about this in U.S. history. But what you should understand now is that even though the Allies took very heavy casualties, they do take the coast. And when they take the coast, that just opens the door. Over a month, 1 million Allied forces end up coming through the coast of France. So now the Germans have an army of over 1 million allies, over 1 million soldiers now storming in from or through the coast of France. Later on, a couple of months after, we have the liberation of France. This is one of my favorite stories. The British and the Americans and the Canadians basically sat back and let the French take their capital city back. There's a great 20-minute news video from the 40s that's about this that people would have seen, and I think it really captures it. We're not going to watch it because it is 20 minutes long, but just know now France is liberated. This is one of the most famous streets. This is probably the most famous street in Paris. It's called the Champs-Élysées. It's the big romantic city. Whenever you think of Paris and all the monuments and stuff, it's usually along this street or very close to the street. And here you have Allied soldiers, American, British, Canadian soldiers marching through, again, as kind of a symbolic victory against the Germans. Now, Hitler is starting to sweat a little bit. The Germans and Nazis are getting kind of nervous because now they suddenly have an army of 1 million soldiers marching towards them from the west. And they are also being attacked from the east by the Soviet Union. Knowing that he was surrounded in the west by the United States and Britain, and by the Soviet Union in the east, Hitler is going to put all his hopes into one last battle to defeat the Allies. This battle is called the Battle of the Bulge. Why? Here's the line, right? This is where the British and the Americans have their front lines, and here's the German side. The Germans basically do a blitz, and they form a bulge in the line, right? It's kind of a bump. The Germans, even though they are putting everything into this final battle, this bulge never expands. It becomes a death trap for the Germans who are here. And the British and American forces basically close in on that. The Germans are defeated and they're pushed back into Germany. Soon after this battle, American, British, Canadian, French forces are all going to cross the Rhine River and they will be in Germany. March 1945, the Allies finally cross the Rhine River into Germany. They bring along 3 million soldiers. Now the US has drafted even more Americans to go in. Now you have 3 million Allied soldiers coming in from the west. And now you have 6 million Soviet soldiers closing in from the east. It's like a noose that's tightening and tightening and tightening up on the Germans. On April 25th, the Soviet Red Army enters Berlin. 5 days later, Hitler commits suicide in his bunker. Here's one of the most famous images from World War II. I think it's even featured in the video game. I think one of the Call of Duties, this is the whole mission where you have to throw the Nazi sign off the Reichstag. and you have to plant the Soviet Union's flag up at the top. That's what they're doing here. This is basically the symbol of the Russians defeating the Germans. And this here is the bunker. This is actually where Hitler would have. This is actually his sofa is the one that he died on. Why did Hitler kill himself? I think he saw what the Italians did to Benito Mussolini. I think he knew that he was responsible for killing millions of people in the Holocaust. And I think he knew that the Russians would especially hate. Remember from the last class, 5.7 million Russians, not soldiers, like regular old Russian civilians, were killed in the Holocaust. And so he knows they're coming for him. If he lives, they're not going to make his life very pleasant. So he's a coward in that way. He kills himself. I know there's a lot of conspiracy theories, but I mean, if he did survive, he wouldn't have stayed hidden forever. I'm sure he would have surfaced somewhere again. Some people think he ran away to Argentina. A lot of Nazis run away to Argentina, but not Hitler. I'm 90% sure he did it. Well, anyways, that brings us to the end. World War II was finally over in Europe. On May 7th, the Germans accepted the unconditional surrender terms, which basically means they wouldn't get anything. They basically said, you know what, whatever the Allies want, we have to do it. A few days later, I believe on May 8th, the Americans finally accept the German surrender, and this is known as VE Day or Victory Europe Day, the 75th anniversary of which was actually a couple of weeks ago. So there were big celebrations, socially distanced celebrations in Europe a couple of weeks ago for the anniversary of the German defeat. So here we are, the last check for understanding. The Allied invasion of Normandy occurred on June 5th, 1944, and this was known as A-Day. And 5, the Nazis accepted terms of unconditional surrender in May 1945. Number 6, the war in the Pacific against Japan is continuing after Germany and Italy surrendered to the Allies, right? Is Japan still going to keep fighting? I don't know. Is that true or false? Take a few moments for our last CFU. So I guess that was a bit unfair. I just realized I forgot to mention, yeah, Japan is still fighting. That was a bit of an unfair question. Japan is not defeated yet. We are going to see how the war in the Pacific against Japan wraps up, comes to an end in the next class. But until then, your next assignment is to do the chapter reading. You'll look at that Allied victory in more details, along with the exit ticket. And as per usual, if you have any questions or need additional support, my office hours are from 3:15 to 4. Except on Wednesdays where they are from 2 to 2:45. And of course, you can always email me at amaduena at allialliance.org. But until then, until I see you, either in person or at office hours, take care, stay safe, and stay healthy. And hopefully we'll get to meet in person soon.